So today's presentation is Assessing Distribution, Genetic Diversity, Occupancy, and Habitat Suitability for Swift Fox in Texas by Dr. Donelle Schwalm, but she goes by Doni. This presentation was funded by Texas Parks and Wildlife through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Restoration Section 4 grant program. And it ran from about 2017 to 2019. And so Dr. Schwalm is the research coordinator for the Swift Fox Conservation Team. She completed her master's and PhD in wildlife sciences at Texas Tech University, where she assessed swift fox distribution in Texas and conducted a range-wide analysis of the influence of landscape structure and genetic diversity and gene flow in swift foxes in the United States. She is currently an assistant professor of environmental biology at the University of Maine. I had the pleasure of working with Doni Schwalm for several years now, and her enthusiasm and excitement for swift foxes is totally infectious, as I'm sure you will find out shortly. Her knowledge of the species is also equally impressive, and I'm really excited for the opportunity for you all to meet Dr. Schwalm and to learn about this project. So with that, if you all will bear with us just for a minute, I am going to hand over screen controls to Doni and allow her to begin presenting.
Okay, is that coming through all right for everybody?
Looks great, thank you.
You bet. Thanks for the introduction, Jonah, and also for the invite to speak at your webinar series. This is going to be fun. So Jonah did warn me that there's a pretty mixed audience today. There's going to be folks that know quite a bit about swift foxes and mammals in general. There's going to be some of y'all who may be budding naturalists and not particularly familiar with the species. So I want to provide a pretty thorough background before we get to this research, just so you know what a swift fox is, because that's the first question that I always get. What's a swift fox? Anytime I'm talking to a landowner or a student or anybody. Well, here's the star of the show. Behold, the magnificent swift fox. The first thing I want to do is point out that they are a really small fox. They're about the size of a house cat with a little bit longer legs, anywhere from 4 to 6 pounds, on average 2.3 kilograms for those of you who work in that system. The biggest challenge that I think folks run into is misidentification. Certainly I run into this a lot. Biologists, trained biologists, all the way down to landowners and just budding naturalists really struggle with identification of the species, in part because it's so uncommon. I think in part because people really want to see one, and so they get rid of it once they know we're looking for them. So let's walk through proper identification for this animal. The three most common misidentifications are coyote, red fox, and gray fox, in that order. Starting with coyotes, the number one thing is that coyotes are 5 to 8 times larger. That's your first dead giveaway. But the coloration is fairly confused. They're often confused for coyote pups, in fact. One of the things that I look for, especially when reviewing imagery, is tail set. Coyotes tend to hang their tail straight down. Foxes in general, especially swift foxes, carry theirs up and sometimes in a slight curved J shape. They also have a short tail compared to foxes in general. So a coyote's got a stubby tail that's hanging down. Their eyes aren't very cat-like. I want you to look at the images of that swift fox. Look at his eyes. They're kind of bulging. They've got cat irises, slit irises. Coyote eyes don't really look like that. And finally, they lack this dark patch on the muzzle. If you look at the muzzle of the swift fox, it's got a fairly dark patch on either side. Coyotes don't really have that. They typically have just a brownish or reddish muzzle. The next most common misidentification is a red fox. And I purposefully included this picture even though it's from Alaska. The red fox is killing and eating a Arctic fox, which is about the same size as a swift fox. So that can give you a bit of an idea of size differential. Red foxes are bigger, 2 to 3 times larger. As their namesake implies, they are generally much more red than a swift fox. And they lack that grizzling. Their guard hairs tend to be black instead of grizzled. Their legs tail and the backs of their ears are black or blackish, which swift foxes do not have. But the money shot, the thing you really want to see is that white tail tip. If you see a white tail tip, you're looking at a red fox. If you see a black tail tip, well, you can't for sure say it's a swift because it also could be a gray fox or a coyote, but you can rule out red foxes. And finally, I get gray foxes quite a bit, which is kind of interesting because really swift foxes and gray foxes aren't in the same kind of habitat as a general rule. Swift foxes are going to be in grasslands generally. Gray foxes like there to be some woody vegetation, especially trees around. Nonetheless, so things to notice. Gray foxes are, as the name implies, gray, much more gray than a swift fox tends to be. In addition to a black tail tip, they have a stripe that runs dorsally along the top of their tail that is also black, and swift foxes don't really have that. In general, they are more stout than a swift fox, and they've got shorter legs. They're kind of stumpy. A swift. I generally think that their ears are more close to a swift, and they tend to look like they're wearing a lot of eye makeup, like they're fixing to go clubbing. They've got black all around their eyes, and often there'll be a black line or at least a black trail leading from the corner of the eye towards the ear. And then finally, their skull is generally more narrow and their muzzle more pointed than one you would expect to see on a swift fox. They've just got a daintier face. So shorter, daintier face, black stripe on the tail, and in general, gray compared to the swift fox, which is a mix of grizzle and red. A little bit about their natural history. Swift foxes' average lifespan is 2 to 3 years, so they don't live very long. That's mostly due to coyotes, which I'll talk about in a minute. But up to 8 years of life have been observed in the wild, and that individual was still reproducing at that age. They're a dietary generalist, from specifically grasshoppers in the summer, all the way to jackrabbits, which are much bigger than them in the winter. They tend to just eat whatever they can get their teeth into. They're monoestrous, and their litter size on average is 3, with a range of 1 to 6 typically. One of the neatest things I think about swift foxes is their flexible breeding strategy. So typically we define them as monogamous, but in reality, there's quite a bit of polyandry and polygyny also observed in their breeding strategies. They're not hugely territorial. In fact, we've observed den sharing amongst unrelated individuals that are not mated. And in some instances, we've seen males combine their litters after the females died. And these are typically related males. So they're really pretty plastic in their approach to life. And I think that's because they don't have a lot of time to live it. So they can't mess around with rules just quite as much as other species do. Typically, dispersal is less than 15 kilometers for juveniles, with males dispersing more than females. But I would caution you that I think this might be an underestimate. Most of our knowledge of dispersal, it comes from VHS collars. And it's really typical, if you query the people that have been using these collars, to have foxes go off air fairly frequently with high numbers. And it's generally assumed that they either died or the collar was destroyed. But in reality, getting away from the range of detection that we can expect with a VHS collar. We found in one instance a natural dispersal of a juvenile female that was 181 kilometers long. And that was in Montana, which is pretty cool. Also, during reintroduction, we've seen movements, and you'll notice I don't call these dispersal because movements pre-reintroduction are a bit different than natal dispersal, but nonetheless, we've recorded a lot of long-distance movements in this scenario with up to 411 kilometers moved. So I think they boogie a little bit more than we think they do, but it's hard to keep up with VHS collars, and our GPS collar technology has proven to be a bit challenging when it comes to swift fox work. And if you don't believe me, look up Andrew Butler's research and talk to him a little bit about his experience using GPSs on swift foxes. Just so you know, not that it's important, they can reach up to 60 kilometers per hour speed, so they really do earn their name, swift fox. This picture shows what I would consider classic swift fox habitat. They like a flat to gently rolling topography that's open, with short-statured vegetation with good view shed. And most of this is so that they can avoid coyotes. They can see coyotes coming and get away. They're typically found in grassland. But I want to point out that in the northern part of their range, Wyoming and Montana specifically, do tend to show up in sagebrush steppe, especially where the ratio of sagebrush to grass is fairly low and the vegetation is short in stature. And in Kansas, and in Kansas only, We tend to find them in cropland about as readily as we find them in grassland, which is unusual because right next door in Colorado and Texas, we find that they avoid crop. It's a mystery that we have not yet solved as to why they persist in crop in some places, but not in others. They frequently use prairie dog colonies, although they don't appear to rely on them. But prairie dog colonies provide food, their burrows provide shelter, and then the fact that the prairie dogs keep that grass trimmed so short provides that short-statured grassland that swift foxes really like. It's particularly valuable in times like in wet years, where the surrounding vegetation can get a bit tall for them. Interestingly, they do not appear to require standing water. Telemetry studies have shown home range mapping that includes no standing water, so it's assumed that they get a reasonable amount of their water from the meat that they eat. Before we can really talk about conservation status, we need to think about the background of the area in which they live, which is the Great Plains, specifically, most typically, the short and mixed grass prairie. Most people, when they think of the short and mixed grass prairie, they think of something like this, big, wide open areas. And because it's so wide open, there can be a perception that there's just a lot of it. But in reality, grasslands and the Great Plains and North America in general are amongst the least protected ecosystems that we've got. They're also really highly disturbed. I really like this painting because it illustrates what's missing. So historically, grasslands would have been burned on a fairly frequent level through lightning strikes and through indigenous fire management. We don't burn the grasslands anymore. It doesn't burn at the frequency that it used to. Historically, there were millions upon millions of bison moving through the landscape, creating a mosaic of short and tall grassland based on where they had grazed, moving fertilizer in the form of their dung all across the grass to a certain degree, disturbing and tilling the soil with their hooves as they moved through. And then finally, if you look at the part of this image, you can see some canid-like things painted in there. Those are wolves. Wolves would have been the historic dominant predator or apex predator in the landscape with major downstream control on things like coyotes. In the absence of wolves, we've seen a pretty big shift with coyotes now dominant and suppression of some mesopredators, in particular swift foxes, which of course are our primary concern today. They used to. Most prairie dog colonies are fairly small. They blink in and out as a result of plague. And so the ability of prairie dogs to provide these short-statured grasslands that historically would have gone for miles and miles, and also to provide food in the form of their bodies for swift foxes and shelter in the form of their burrows has also been reduced. And there are some pretty large contemporary anthropogenic disturbances on the landscape as well, with agricultural development being the biggest one, followed by energy extraction, and on the horizon we have wind energy extraction. Not been documented to negatively affect swift foxes, but also we really haven't looked yet. So it's a question mark that's still out there. Now, in the context of all this wide-scale disturbance, it should probably come as no surprise that what was once a really common species, defined by Lewis and Clark as incredibly common, stories and cultures throughout the Great Plains, is now a rare or at least uncommon species. They've experienced at least a 50% decline in their distribution. The historic distribution in this figure is shown in gray. The current distribution is shown in black. And most of the areas that are shown in black, swift foxes are actually patchy within that. So it's not continuous distribution even in those regions. This was driven in part through predator control programs. So back in the day when we were kind of whacking everything left and right with poison and shooting and trapping, we weren't necessarily targeting swift foxes, but they're really easy to trap, but they're super naive. They're not particularly cautious. And so we really reduced their numbers through this particular management strategy. Then, of course, as I've mentioned, agricultural development converts the grasslands that they like to the cropland fields that they tend to not like throughout the majority of their distribution. And we see increased mortality through increased coyote density. So again, without wolves, we have more coyotes. With more coyotes, we expect more mortality of swift foxes, with mortality rates linked to coyotes ranging from anywhere from 30 up to 77% of the total recorded mortalities. The Endangered Species Act, and a warranted but precluded decision was found. They are no longer on the candidate list. They have varying protection at the state level, ranging anywhere from endangered the fur bearer, and in Texas, they are currently listed as a fur bearer. And they're considered a sensitive species for monitoring purposes by the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. About swift foxes in Texas specifically, which is the focus of our talk today, they were commonly fairly widespread. And in fact, in some areas where they're no longer present, we still have them as a mascot, such as Nazareth. The historic distribution is a bit of a question mark. We have limited historic records, and challengingly, in the past, those records weren't necessarily differentiated very clearly between kit foxes and swift foxes. In fact, for a while, they were considered genetically the same species, with just different subspecies. They are currently considered separate species. This figure shows the general accepted historic distribution of swift foxes in Texas in grade. It's probably including quite a bit of kit fox data, but this is what we've got right now. At the figure on the left, you'll see results of a survey conducted by Kevin Mote in 97 and 98 for swift foxes. Everything that has a circle was surveyed. The only swift foxes are shown with black circles, which are Dallam and Sherman County. If you look at the figure on the right, you'll see survey results from some work I did as a master's student from 2005 to 2008. Everything that has a symbol was surveyed. The areas in white circles are the only places where I found swift foxes, and they reflect what Mote found, so only Dallam and Sherman County. Since that time, a graduate student at Texas Tech has completed an additional survey in Dallam and Sherman counties and only found swift foxes in Dallam. So at the time of the start of this study, there was a question mark as to whether swift foxes were still extant in Sherman County or if they were just in Dallam County at this time. Declines of swift foxes in Texas reflect the declines we see nationwide: extensive conversion of grasslands for agriculture, unregulated harvest, and unfortunately mistaken identification or perhaps intentional persecution. This is a swift fox that was shot and hung on the fence by the landowner. It's that some folks. Unfortunately, mortality is a big issue for swift foxes in Texas. That figure that I gave you was 77% mortality linked to swift fox deaths, linked to coyotes. That's from Texas, from a study conducted by Jan Kamler in 2003, I think it was. So in this background, we had several different objectives that we wanted to do. One, we wanted to assess the current distribution of swift fox in the Texas Panhandle. Texas is part of the Swift Fox Conservation Team, and the general agreement or plan amongst the members of that team is to try and survey your swift fox populations every 5 to 10 years. So we were at the 10-year mark since the last official Texas Parks and Wildlife funded survey and my grad work. We also wanted to identify potentially suitable habitat for swift fox in the Texas Panhandle. And then finally, we wanted to contemporary genetic diversity to the 2008 genetic diversity benchmark that I developed. I'm going to go work through the methods and results of each of these objectives individually instead of doing all the methods and then all the results separately. So let's start for the surveys. We were using camera surveys. This is the general survey stage and setup. We would map to an existing structure, typically a fence post, sometimes a power pole line. And then 3 meters in front of that camera, we would hammer a wooden stake into the ground at the 16-inch height. And we would put a variety of really delicious lures on that stake and also hammer a cat food can in front of the stake, all of which was intended to try and hold the animal in front of the camera once we brought it in. The reason for that is most of the imagery that you get for fox or in general low light. And we wanted those images to be as crisp as possible to improve the identification abilities. We were looking for areas where you're likely to find swift foxes. So areas for those of you who have any potential trapping experience for canids, H-braces, fence intersections, game trails, game crossings under the fence, road fence intersections, places that foxes or other canids tend to mark and tend to be easy to catch at. And we were looking for landscapes that look generally like this, open and flat with short statured grasslands. So we were really targeting the areas that we thought they were most likely to be in, but we also set in areas that looked potentially promising, but maybe just a little overgrown, like this image that I originally had up, and you can't see it very much anymore, but there's quite a bit of sage in that picture. So we set some marginal habitats as well, just to double check, just in case they were there and we didn't want to miss them. These are the lures we used, Powder River and Canine Call. They are both very skunky. If you're interested in canine or really any kind of mesocarnivore trapping, these are really good lures to use. They bring everything in. This is what this survey would look like looking back from the scent station. So you've got your scent station facing your camera, and that's just the general look of it. Each of these camera stations were grouped so that we would have a survey area. And in that survey area, we would try to have 5 stations, which would look roughly like this. 1 central camera, 4 satellite cameras, all of them spaced 5 and 2 kilometers from each other. Those were our general parameters. With this kind of spacing and the assumption that the swift foxes were moving around in this area, we assumed that we were surveying about the same sized area as 1 swift fox territory. We completed the survey over a 10-day period, so we'd put the cameras out and then we'd leave them for 10 days and come back. We surveyed each area once, ideally once per year, during mid-August to November. So this is when the juveniles are independent, new breeding territories are being established, and the population is just at its zenith, and thus it's most detectable. We completed surveys for 2 years, 2017 and 2018. And that was an undertaking. I worked mostly with students on this. I had 2 and generally 3 students looking at every image that was reviewed. And then every image that was flagged as a swift fox, I would go back in and double check myself. And most of the images that were flagged as coyotes, I would also go back and look at to determine, just to double check those identifications. We recorded all the species that we observed, in addition to the time, temperature, and some behavior notes at each of those locations. We got a whole bunch of things. I feel like I could just spend half the talk showing you awesome pictures of things that came through on the camera, like these red-winged blackbirds or this, general variety of organisms. It was really fascinating to see what the people and the humans were doing when they didn't know they were being watched. So if anybody has any kind of interest in biodiversity assessment outside of this study and you're interested in this data, please reach out to me because I think it'd be interesting to use it for other things. I just haven't had a chance to do so. Was to make sure that we were not making misidentifications between our canids, keeping in mind that canid misidentification is an issue. These are images taken by the cameras, and you'll see now, I hope, the role of that wooden stake, which was 1, a platform for the scent lure, but 2, a measuring standard. By consistently measuring the ground 17 inches, which is about the height of a swift fox, which is this image that you see in the bottom here. That's a swift fox at one of the stations. You can see the tips of his ears are just under that wooden stake. We can also make some judgment calls about the other things we see. Red foxes should be just a little bit taller than the stake. Coyotes should tower over the stake. And of course, you can also see some of those visual cues, like the coyotes, again, have their tail hanging down, and they look like coyotes. The red foxes look kind of grayish, almost smoky in a black and white picture. And you can also see that blackish tint to their legs and their tail, although you can't see the tip of the tail in this red fox in the lower left-hand corner. But the wooden stake was really important for especially those students as they were learning to identify the pictures, but then also as a gauge overall to ensure that we weren't making mistakes in our IDs. This is what our survey effort looked like. Everything's color-coded. Areas that are in yellow were surveyed both years, and you'll notice that we were focusing on areas where swift foxes had been observed fairly recently, of swift fox presence just based on habitat quality. Areas in red we only surveyed 1 year. Mostly that was due to access issues. We needed to move on, so there's also some time constraints there. And then areas in blue we only surveyed in the 2nd year. The major increase in our survey effort. This was spurred on by a conversation with Joan where he suggested that we might try and get into a lot more of those areas instead of resurveying some of the spots that we couldn't necessarily get to very easily. So we did a bunch more work in a bunch of other areas in blue. is really influential in helping get some access to these and kind of push us to do some of these additional spots. So in general, or in total, we surveyed 193 areas across both years, and our total survey hours in 2017 were almost 73,000, and our total survey hours in 2018 were about double that. So just shy of 140,000 hours, camera hours of survey. These are our results. Now we've zoomed in. They're color coded again. Blue means we did not detect a swift fox. Everything. So these are the only places that we found swifts. Anything that's in green, we. 2018, we had areas causing 26 cameras. In 2018, we had 13 survey areas with swift foxes, for a total of 29 cameras. So a slight gain, but not much. Everything was in Dallin County, except one fox that we saw one time at one camera in 2017. And this is right down here. This little green dot in Hartley County is what was a very small fox, and I'm guessing probably a disperser, given that we only saw it once, but it's hard to be sure. We did not find swift foxes in Sherman County during these surveys. The total, when we add in foxes that we detected at live trapping locations, which is part of the genetic analysis I'll talk about in a minute, increases just a little bit. Mostly there was a lot of overlap from where we had found them on camera, but you'll notice where these red stars are that there are a couple in places where we did not find them on camera, but we did manage to trap them. So in some cases, we hadn't even set a camera there. In some cases, we set a camera, didn't find them, but then we got them in the box. So overall, total number of locations, including live trapping, was 30. Now let's talk about objective 2, which is identifying potentially suitable swift fox habitat in the Texas Panhandle. For this, we were using a modeling framework called Random Forest, and these are the variables that we included. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to point out a couple important things. Everything that we used had some justification in the literature or an expert opinion. We were looking at topography, vegetation structure, and specifically focused on things like crops and grasses, and then anthropogenic development, meaning things in concrete. We calculated these variables at 2 different radii. One reflected the home range size, and reflected the distribution radius. So that's what these 13 and 18 are after each of the variables. If it says 13 after the variable, that is the home range size calculation. And if it says 18 after the variable, that is the average distribution sized radius. And these were using a moving window analysis in ArcGIS. When we feed those variables into Random Forest, we have a couple issues to deal with. First of all, we have a highly zero inflated data set. For those of you who are familiar with this kind of modeling, it can be a big issue. We're surveying areas where swift foxes might be in hopes that we find them, but in reality, as the model appears to show, they're not there. So we end up with 668 zeros or non-detections to 52 detections. Not so great. So what we decided to do to try and get around this zero inflation, which can lead to some pretty big bias in your models, is to generate maps using 2 different inputs. The first of these was a model that was just all of the data, ignoring that zero inflation. And then the second model was to use a trimmed data set that was focused just on the area where swift foxes had in general been seen in the last 15 years. This still resulted in a zero inflated data set. So these numbers now are 231 non-detections to 52 detections. This is the best that I felt we could do without becoming overly subjective in our choices. So this was the best objective result that I could come up with. Then we used both models to predict habitat suitability across the study area. For those of you who are familiar with Random Forest, we ran the analysis with 1,000 to 5,000 trees, and the models were fairly stable, even at the low level. We chose the less fit of those models. This is what that model structure looks like. The model variables are ranked from most important to least important. All data is the complete data set. Trimmed data is the model generated just from that area of focus where swift foxes had been seen fairly recently. Grass and crop and scrub show up in almost all or all of the models in some way. No big surprise. These are the primary drivers of swift fox occupancy throughout their range. So the models seem to be tracking what we understand about swift foxes. But you should notice that the pseudo R squared, which is a measure of explanatory power, is fairly low. In fact, it's pretty low. I hypothesize that this is driven by the fact that we have two variables we can't include in the models because they don't exist. The first of these is a variable that would map vegetation height across the study area. We know that vegetation height is critical to swift foxes, but that data set doesn't exist, and it would change every year depending on temperature regimes, precipitation regimes, whether or not any kind of fire had occurred, whether or not the rancher had grazed it heavy that year or not. So it would need recreating every year in order to be useful, but it doesn't exist in any form right now. So that's, I think, part of the variation that's being lost. The second part is a continuous layer that looks at either the density and or distribution of coyotes, because we know that coyotes are a major influence for swift foxes, and that swift foxes tend to structure their home ranges so that they're at the periphery of coyote home ranges, and unfortunately we just don't have that data. That again would increase the predictive power of the model. So right now what we're really looking at is a model that thinks about the kind of long-term habitat structure, but doesn't get at those fine scale variables that might change from year to year, but are really important. The out of bag estimate, or OOB, is good. This is your misclassification error, and in general those variables are low. That means that the model is consistently characterizing appropriately a non-detection as a non-detection and a detection as a detection when you retest it. That's good. We want to see that. These are the rankings of model variable importance in the model, with all data on the left and trim data on the right. You can see the really strong importance of scrub as a negative driver in the trim data set. It doesn't really show up in the all data set, right? So we're looking across a much broader area with less scrub. Here we see grass at both the home range and dispersal distance showing up as really important, as well as corn with a negative influence. So corn is something that swift foxes tend to not use. These are what those models look like when they're predicted to the landscape. The way to interpret these particular surfaces is the hotter the color, the less likely a swift fox is going to be there. So red is a no-go zone according to the model, and deep dark green is a place that we would predict focal area included. And you'll notice that the model is just the focal area. Yeah?
Sorry to interrupt. Your audio cut out for just a minute. Can you just kind of restart this slide, maybe?
Yeah, okay. So sorry about that.
Thanks.
Probably the wind blowing and ruining my Wi-Fi. Okay, so these are the models predicted onto the landscape. This is what the models tell us when we look at how where swift fox ought to be, or at least habitat ought to be on the landscape. The way to interpret them is that red is bad, green is good. So a nice dark green area is a place we would expect to be suitable for swift foxes. An area that's deep red, we wouldn't anticipate that foxes would be there at all. The models agree in that a lot of the area is red or orange. Much of this particular region is not suitable for swift foxes based on these models. They disagree in where they predict the green, and the more conservative of those two is the figure B, which is the model that was created with the truncated or sampled data, so just the areas where swift foxes have been recently. It predicts really well where we find swift foxes, and it predicts really well where swift foxes occur outside of Texas, actually. So this area right here to the left is New Mexico. There are foxes there, and it gets that well. And then up here on the ridge are, at the edge of that map, are areas in green that are in Oklahoma. And those are generally where it's doing a pretty good job. And it tells us that there's probably some really good habitat over here in the eastern part of our study area. And then down here in what's Deaf Smith, Roberts, and Castro, there's some yellow and green that's implied to be good as well. So how do we interpret these model predictions? Both models accurately classify the currently occupied areas, so they don't miss those. That's good. We have low misclassification error. That's also really good. There are large areas of unsuitable habitat in the region, and the models tend to agree, even missing some of those important variables that I was talking about. They still agree in that component, and so that's important information to have. The model's point targets high levels of spatial isolation and fragmentation between areas that are good. We know that percent crop and percent scrub have a negative association, and percent grass have positive associations, which tracks with how we understand swift fox habitat preferences throughout their distribution. We can't ignore that zero inflation. This is going to result in a conservative, and in some ways is a perhaps overly conservative estimate for these models. So it's possible that we're missing some suitable areas because there's no foxes in them currently, and they were mapped to zero, but they could be suitable. They're just not there. In general, I would say that these models identify targets for habitat restoration and population expansion. I think that there are some areas that are missing, and there needs to be ground truthing in any situation where management is proposed for swift foxes using these models. And one of the questions that I anticipate, because I've been asked it before, is why are there no foxes in some of the areas that appear to be suitable? And for that, I think we need to really think about the history. My hypothesis is that we're dealing with a history of extirpation, so they were wiped out from these areas. Then they're isolated from any kind of robust source population that would feed into recolonization. So our Texas population is definitely not a robust population and not particularly good as a resource for recolonization. So no foxes, or at least not enough foxes, dispersing to recolonize these areas that are very far away from any kind of source. And then we have to acknowledge really high coyote-related mortality, which tends to peak during dispersal. So any fox that does try to disperse to those areas has a pretty high probability of dying before it gets there or once it gets there. Okay, let's talk about objective 3. This is tracking genetic diversity and comparing it contemporary metrics to historic metrics. And I say historic, but not really. 2008 is not that far along. So here's how we got our samples. The benchmark data that I collected as a PhD student was collected between 2005 and 2008. And we got these from roadkill and live trapping. So these images that I'm showing here are, actually it's my current students, but anyway, handling swift foxes and collecting a tissue sample. We got a total of 69 samples this way. During this study, we also did some live trapping, and we found a few roadkills, and we found 2 swift foxes that had been shot and dumped on a pile with coyotes. We sampled those as well, but the majority of our samples actually came from scat. Now remember, I told you that we were nailing a cat food can to the ground in front of our wooden stake. Well, some of that is in fact to give something for anything that comes in to like toy around with and hold in front of the camera, but also canids, and especially swift foxes or foxes in general, really like to poop on smelly things. Probably a territorial marking, scent marking sort of thing, but this is just something that they do, as the fox in the bottom is kindly demonstrating for us. Now, conveniently, you can get DNA from the exterior of these scats, so we took advantage of that. In total, we had 15 tissue samples, 13 of which amplified, so we had 13 individuals, and we had 167 scats. They were very generous in providing us with samples. When we removed the ones that weren't amplifying, removed the ones that weren't from swift foxes, and et cetera, we ended up with 48 genotypes. After assessing those to determine, to identify unique individuals, we have 25 individuals. So our final data set for the contemporary time step was 38 individuals. Those of you who are laboratory geeks, I'll just briefly tell you what we did. We used a species ID to confirm that the scat example we were actually looking at was indeed a swift fox and not something else. We used a sex ID just out of curiosity, and I didn't put it in here, but the sex ratios are pretty balanced for swift foxes. And then we constructed genotypes using 14 microsatellite loci. They were developed by by a variety of those of us who work with swift foxes for these kind of analyses. We then calculated observed heterozygosity and allelic richness, which was corrected for imbalanced samples and the benchmark data set. We then used Wilcoxon rank sum tests to assess differences between these 2 time periods. And here's the good news. I do have some good news. There's no difference for either metric. So heterozygosity between time periods, the p-value for that test was 0.31. allelic richness between time periods. The p-value was 0.57. So there's no evidence of losses in diversity or heterozygosity in the last 10 years, which, if you're familiar with genetic metrics, shouldn't be a huge surprise. That's just a couple generation times for swift foxes, and in general, it takes a little bit longer to see declines, but hopefully we'll continue to monitor genetic diversity in this population, so since it's so small. And that way we can catch it if it happens. Placing this all in context, these are some results from my PhD. Swift foxes are part of a larger genetic subgroup, which in this map is shown in purple. Each of these colors is a unique genetic subgroup. They are part of a grouping that includes northeastern New Mexico, Oklahoma, parts of Colorado, and Kansas. So they are all one group, and they all rely on each other for change. If we lose swift foxes in Texas, we'll likely see a decline in genetic diversity elsewhere. Likewise, if we see declines in swift fox populations outside of Texas, we can anticipate declines in genetic diversity in Texas as well. The Texas population also is unique. We looked at mitochondrial analysis for my PhD, and what we found is that there is a haplotype that's found only in Texas. It's not found anywhere else, and it's shown in the red circle here. It's those little black squares, so these are each unique things. So we've got a couple, actually, I lied a little. We also find it here in Colorado, probably dispersers, but the bulk is right here in Texas. So they've got their own unique signature, which could imply some importance for conservation in terms of overall diversity in the species. So in summary, we have consistent negative associations between crop, scrub, and swift foxes, consistent positive associations between the percentage of grass and swift foxes. We do have areas of unoccupied habitat. They exist, but they're small and they're isolated and not necessarily easy for swift foxes to repatriate. There's no population expansion in the last, 2 decades at least, since Kevin Mote's work. We haven't seen any expansion. And in fact, swift fox appear to be one of the 2 counties where historically they've kind of hung on, which would be Sherman County. Anecdotally, while I was doing this work, they were also absent in a couple areas in Dallam County where I had traditionally found them as a graduate student. So we set cameras, we set traps, we never saw them. And some of the areas where I had found swift foxes in the future had actually been plowed up, or in one case wasn't being grazed, it was for sale. In both instances, they were no longer suitable for swift foxes. Happily though, ending again on a positive note, evidence of loss of genetic diversity. So far they're hanging tough. Friend Swift Fox would like to know, now what? Now that we have all this information, what will we do? We have a small, isolated population that's not showing any signs of growth and in fact appears to be declining, that exhibits, lack of patriation in areas that are potentially suitable. What do we do? Well, happily, we've been working with swift foxes for a really long time, and there are a number of management levers that we can pull to try and help swift foxes in Texas. The number one thing that I personally would recommend is habitat restoration. And this is the thing that we always do last. And I don't know why, because in reality, it's probably the most important thing we could do, especially in an area like Texas where it's so disturbed. So this means doing some burning, intensive grazing, rotational grazing to get that grass short, and even mowing if you can't burn, to get that short stature grass back on the landscape. I would argue that we need to find a way to work with the feds to replant a lot of those CRP fields to native grasses, weeping love grass and windmill grass and stuff that it's not useful for swift foxes. What they need is Cytodes grama and blue grama and buffalo grass. And that's not what our CRP is in Texas. We would benefit a lot of grassland species if we did this work, not just swifts. There are several management techniques that can be used to remove woody vegetation, such as cholla, yucca, and mesquite from areas that are otherwise grassland. And there's large areas of these, like in Oldham and Deaf Smith and some of those more southerly counties, with great grass underneath it, but too much woody vegetation right now. My argument would be that we should use these methods to strategically grow the existing population and then help build some connections to these isolated patches that are not inhabited currently. Another thing to be done is to reduce coyote-related mortality and increase the density of swift foxes in Dallam County. Now, one of the things you can do is control. there are multiple studies that have demonstrated that coyote control will benefit swift fox populations in the short term. But the problem with coyote control is that you have to do it every year, and you have to do a lot of it. And that's a lot of money. That's a lot of logistic time commitment. And I think realistically, it's not something that can be used. So I'm pointing it out because it's demonstrated in the literature to work, but I'm not recommending it, certainly not as a long-term solution. Escape cover is an option. McGee et al. Adapted this for swift foxes from some work that was done by Brian Cypher for kits. Essentially, it creates little dens in the ground with plastic tubing, and it does work. You demonstrated that you can facilitate the development of new territories with it. When Colton Laws went back out in 2017, he found that most of these structures were filled with dirt. So there's some maintenance that does need to occur. You can't just put them in the ground and leave them, but it's less maintenance than coyote shooting, that's for sure. I do think we need to think about reducing human-related mortality, and that probably means closing the harvest season. And I think equally importantly, educating the public on swift fox ID and the difference between a swift fox and a coyote, both in terms of how they look and then their likelihood to, for example, kill your livestock. Swift foxes aren't going to do that. They're not a risk to most operators. Inevitably, in situations like this, reintroduction gets brought up. Reintroduction is a tool that's been used for swift foxes in a lot of places. My personal take is that it's way too soon for reintroduction in Texas, that there's considerable amount of work that needs to be done for habitat restoration. Most of the places where there aren't swift foxes, but potentially could be swift foxes, are fairly small. And small isolated populations of swift foxes have historically done poorly. In fact, most of our reintroduction efforts have failed because they created small isolated populations of swift foxes. So I would avoid that path until such a time as you have enough habitat on the landscape to move forward with reintroduction that would create a large population and a connected population instead of a small isolated one. There is, in fact, some really good swift fox habitat out there that is not inhabited. I showed you this picture as like a classic of where I would expect to find swift foxes. This picture is from Roberts County in Texas. There are no swift foxes there. At least we didn't detect any, and they haven't been detected there recently. So it's out there, but we need to do some work to make it so that swift foxes could actually persist in those areas. I'm going to take a quick second to just thank Texas Parks and Wildlife for the invitation today, and especially for the money. They funded this entire project. OSU and UMF did provide some financial support. These pictures show a variety of the students that came out into the field and helped collect data. And I don't have pictures of the students reviewing the images, but there's an even bigger body of them. Richard Quillhurst helped me out in the lab. These last two pictures are of a collaborator, Clint Epps. He's the Daniel Crockett looking one, Davy Crockett, I mean. And then Nancy McIntyre, who is at Texas Tech University and came out into the field with us 1 day or 2 days as well. With that, if time, I'll take questions.
Doni, thanks so much. I'm getting a little bit of echo coming from your end. Can you mute while I'm talking?
Figure it out. Give me a second here.
Sure.
I think I need to stop sharing to mute.
Hang on. I might be able to
You can mute
you from my end. There, I muted you. Okay, so anyway, what I was saying is thank you so much. I was just going to give a minute for all the applause to die down. I know that sometimes these webinars are a little funny because you can't. There's very little kind of immediate reaction from the crowd. But thank everyone for joining as well. There are quite a few questions that came in, so let me just take a quick look. Okay, so let me go back just a second here. Okay, so one of the questions was, are hair follicles also a useful genetic sampling technique for swift fox, or is there some reason that they couldn't be, or that they wouldn't be very effective? And hang on, I will unmute you so you can answer.
I'm glad you remembered to unmute me because I about just started talking. So yes, I've used hair samples to do genetic work for swift foxes in Montana, but those were plucked originally from the individual. The challenge with like a non-invasive hair sampling technique, like you might be familiar with for bears and whatnot, we haven't come up with a structure that would adequately sample swift foxes without sampling multiples. So for example, we've thought about some kind of scratching post or something that they could kind of rub on. But the reality is that we'd probably end up with a bunch of swift fox samples on there instead of just one, unless we were able to check them every day. And with that kind of spatial distribution, we can't get to the cameras every day. They do work though. If there's anybody who's feeling creative about coming up with a hair sampling technique, I can confirm that you will get DNA from those bulbs if you can figure out a way to keep the samples separate between individuals.
Great, and we have actually quite a few other questions that came in. One of them that several people had was about how did you get access to so much private land? I know some of these are from other researchers that have worked in the same area, and I think I can just say that it helps having a critter like a swift fox is cheating a little bit, but otherwise, Doni, what else can you add to that?
Well, I think that's actually a lot of it. They like their swift foxes. If they know they've got them, they really like them. In fact, I've had landowners in other states tell me, no, you can't come on here because I don't want you to harm my swift foxes. So there's a general tendency to really be open to any kind of monitoring associated with swifts because they're not listed. And I suppose that's why I'd say if listing is on the table, to proceed with caution and really try and partner with those landowners. Maybe let them know what's coming, talk about their concerns because they're partners right now. Keeping partners would be great. I spent a lot of time on the phone. I spent a lot of time knocking on doors. It helps that I grew up on a cattle ranch, and I can talk about, yeah, I'll shut the gate. No, I won't run your cows. But I think that most researchers know that as well. The other thing is that a lot of those cameras were set on roadsides. So we set them on the fence, not inside the property. If we couldn't get a hold of the landowner or, if we couldn't figure out who the landowner was, which was a reality in a lot of the spots, we'd stick them on the fence.
Another question that we had was if swift foxes ever show up in predator contests.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I am sure that they do. I don't know where I would find those data, but I can tell you just anecdotally that I've found like those online predator forums where people get online and post what they've killed. And I found more than one instance where some guy is standing there with this swift fox that he's killed, and he's like, smallest cow I ever saw. So frustratingly, misidentification is an issue. They didn't even have it in hand and they don't know what they've got. I am positive that they end up there, but I don't have any data that says they do.
Great. And then we also had a question about someone wanted to know the specific baits that you used, the lures, like exactly what you were using. What did you find that worked better and whatnot?
Okay. So for the camera trapping, the two lures that I used were Powder River paste bait. And you can buy both of these at F&T for harvesters, if I remember correctly. So Powder River paste bait is a paste bait, like it says, and it's a chunky, it's thicker. It doesn't dry out as fast, so it kind of holds the scent lure in place for a while. It's really gross. The other one I used is Canine Call, and I think that's made by O'Gorman, but I've got it at F&T for harvesters. That's a liquid oil base. It volatilizes very quickly, so it spreads in the air and probably travels a little bit further, but it's not going to stick around as a smell as long as Powder River. So I was using those two things in conjunction, a long-term one and then a kind of really stinky but gone faster one. And we would put that on the post. We'd also take a little flag of the Canine Call, the oily one, like so we'd like dip a grass seed head or something in it, and then we'd stick it in the barbed wire fence up right in front of the camera so that it would carry it a little bit further. When we're trapping, our favorite bait to put in the trap is rabbits, but I'm guessing that you're talking about the camera lure, so I'll stop there. But if anybody has questions about how to catch a swift fox, is a little bit different bait scenario there.
And then Nicole Bjornley asked, I'm really excited by the potential that the scat collection may provide. For those sites where you detected swift fox, how successful were you at also collecting scat? Also, do you have a general ballpark cost to run the scat samples?
Oh, yeah. So I love scat officially in the sense that I can think of multiple occasions where we knew swift fox had been there because they left tracks and they dug at the back of the trap and they left a little like chocolate Hershey Kiss swift fox scat for us. So we didn't catch the fox, but we got the scat. It's a nice way to catch them when they won't go in the trap. I would say that every single place that, well, no, most of the places that we got them on camera, we also had a scat. Not all. I can think of a few where they didn't leave a scat for us, but mostly they will poop for you. There was a second part of that question, and it just flew the coop. Oh, the cost. The cost, yeah. So if you're just doing a species ID, it's fairly cheap. If you're also trying to construct a genotype, it's a little bit more expensive. General ballpark is going to be somewhere around $55 to $65 per scat for like 3 panels of microsatellites. And the species ID test is going to be less. I would say probably around $20 or $30 if you're just looking for species ID. So the thing to keep in mind, though, and this is really important to keep in mind, not all your scats work, right? We had 167 scats. There was a fairly high number of scats that failed. Now, some of that is because the markers that we were using hadn't been optimized for scats before, so we were doing that as we were also doing the analysis. And I think if I had had a little bit more time, I would have been able to optimize them and we would have had a little bit better amplification success. But if you get 167 scats, you're not necessarily going to get 100, you're not going to get 167 IDs. You'll probably get somewhere around 50 to 60% of those to work in a really good lab with really optimized primers, maybe just a little bit higher than that.
Okay, Don, we have a couple more questions and only like 0 minutes left, but I figured what we could do is maybe try to go for like 1 or 2 word answers for some of these pretty quick questions. Like, what model of Browning cameras did you use?
Dark Ops HD.
How do you distinguish between kit and swift foxes, or is it just a matter of habitat and location?
Habitat, location, facial structure, and DNA.
So, but from cameras, you assumed that if it looked like one of those two, it was a swift fox. We didn't try to assume either because of the location. Yeah. That's
right. We trapping anywhere we would expect a kit, but yeah, we assumed swift.
Did you evaluate if there was a benefit to camera trap versus live trap versus both?
We had all of our live traps and documented multiple occasions where the fox approached the trap and did not enter. I think you're going to get higher detection with a camera than a trap.
Do you have any comments on the status of the species range-wide? Stable, increasing, decreasing?
In general, they appear to be stable and actually increasing. Most recently in Wyoming, stable to increasing in Colorado, stable in Kansas, stable but below densities in South Dakota, Montana, Nebraska, and New Mexico and Oklahoma. I don't know how long it's been since they surveyed.
And did you get any spotted skunks on your trail camera pictures?
No, but I really wanted to. I would love to get one of those, but no.
And if anybody else had questions that I did not address, I apologize. I've been doing my best to try to field the different different questions here. But if you haven't, you feel free to ask it again in the chat right now, or you can pass the or send us an email. And if you hold on just 1 second, I am just going to become the presenter again.
I see one from David Augustine about the Rita Blanca.
Great. You want to address that briefly while I'm getting this whole thing set up?
I can pretty confidently say if the Rita Blanca weren't there, we probably would not have swift foxes in Texas. The vast majority of those detections were on the Rita Blanca. There's a couple private landowners that have big swaths of grass. They keep it grazed pretty short, and they've had swifts for years. But without the Rita Blanca, we'd be in trouble. I do think that increasing grazing intensity would benefit swift foxes on the Rita Blanca. They I think, changed their grazing regime in the last 10 years, and so it's a little bit tall. The other thing I'll point out, and I have no data for this, but it's an area of concern and potential research. I know that in that area, including on the Rita, they spray neonics for grasshoppers. Grasshoppers are like one of the primary sources of food for swifts in the summer. And I would suspect, but cannot confirm with any kind of empirical data, that spraying probably doesn't help them out very much. I'll also
And you
point
mean
out,
like neonics, you're talking about like neonicotinoid
yeah,
pesticides, right?
neonicotinoids.
Yeah.
That's right.
But okay, so one person, so Kristen Warren commented, no, they do not spray that on the Rita Blanca.
Oh, Kristen, you asked me about that once. You asked if they would be okay to. Never mind, we can talk about it later.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you're spraying for grasshoppers anywhere, that's probably not good for them. However, since Kristen's on the line, I'll point out that she's also very interested in fire. And if there's a possibility of any kind of fire partnerships, that'd probably be great.
Well, Doni, thank you again so much for the presentation. Hopefully folks learned a whole lot. I did, and are interested in learning more about swift foxes. I'm sure people can reach out to you if they have questions. Is there a certain way that you prefer people to reach you?
Yeah, email's the best way. Do you have my email? I can share it in the chat.
Maybe say it out loud right now, and then we can put it in the chat as well.
Okay. So it's my first name, Donelle dot last name, SCHWALM at maine.edu.
Okay, I just sent that to everyone. And
Okay.
and then if you are interested again in trying to gain, learn about other upcoming webinars and presentations from this series, here's the website. And thank you again for giving this presentation and everyone for participating.